you have to know that there has been a slight change in the program of this track because we want, so the plan was also to have a contribution of Liguria. So unfortunately, the speaker cannot be here. So we decided to make a slight change, and in order to introduce a little bit the topics that also the speaker afterwards are going to present, I have decided to tell you a story. The story has a name. This name is Mobility as a Service for Italy, MAAS for Italy. Before to start, I would like to ask you, somebody of you knows about Mobility as a Service? You don't have to. Okay, very, very little, I would say. So some, yes. But maybe I would like to show. So the dream of Mobility as a Service, which is the real innovation in the mobility sector, is at the end to provide to the end user, so what you can see in the picture above, the freedom of mobility, the dream of freedom of mobility, which nowadays is provided by your car, because you can take it, you can go everywhere at every time. And the idea is that you, through a super app, you can have access to all the mobility services very, very simply, and you can plan your trip in a very smooth way without understanding on how you have to analyze and get in contact with all the operators. All the features like booking, payments, everything is already hidden in this technological infrastructure. There are already some operators that are providing this kind of services, and they have implementing this kind of architecture. So every mobility, so they are called Mobility as a Service operator or MAAS operator, and they have a lot of integration with a lot of operators, and this is quite a mess, as you can see, from a technical architecture. The Ministry of Transportation has said, now we could do things a little bit better, and we have decided, let's introduce this kind of architecture. This is the scope of this MAAS4ITALY, and the idea is to introduce a so-called, so it's called the DSRM at the moment. So it is data services, and I don't remember exactly the repository registry, but something like this. And the idea is that the MAAS operators could have access to here, and through this central architecture, you have access to all the mobility data that all the operators should provide. And this data should be provided first to so-called regional access points. So the idea is that each region in Italy has its own, let's say, access point, like, for example, the Open Data Hub here for South Tyrol. These access points are connected to this national architecture, and from there, the MAAS operators could just connect here and have everything. So without implementing the things as in the picture at the left. What is also important is that since a lot of years, so actually 2017, there is an EU regulation that says, that the EU says all member states have to provide their mobility data, real-time and planned data, through open standards. And which are the open standards? Are these guys here, NetEx and SIRI. We are going to hear a lot in the next presentation about them. Okay, so it's very important as framework. So what are NetEx and SIRI? Just for you, so these are defined by these European committees for standardization. And they are all part of bigger, let's say, families of standards. Here I've put everything. NetEx and SIRI are the most important ones. So they define interfaces, so APIs, or they are not just APIs, they are also exports. So, for example, XML files. But what is also important is that there is a standard for the definition of, let's say, of the semantic, which is this trans model, which defines the data model for mobility. So when we speak about, for example, a public transport line or a bus stop, so before there was a lot of understanding, because maybe for you the stop is just the point where the bus stops, or it's, for example, like a train station, which you can have a lot of points in which the trains or buses can stop. So it was very important to have this defined and then this interface defined. Okay? What are NetEx and SIRI? Maybe there will be also some further information, but just for you, it's very simple. NetEx is static data. So, for example, the network topology, description of the stops, the timetables, everything. So it started with a public transportation, now has been extended to all the kind of mobility services nowadays we can imagine, sharing mobility, parking, everything what you can imagine is now modeled with NetEx. And on the other side, SIRI. SIRI is the interface. This is an API for sharing real-time information. So, for example, the real-time occupancy of parking areas, the delays of buses, and all this kind of stuff. Somebody of you have used or heard about the GTFS? These formats are about Google? Somebody, yes? You have to note that in the past and in the market, there is a lot of usage about very simple standards, which are GTFS and GTFS real-time, and a lot of different variations with GBFS for the bike sharing, for example. This was defined by Google a lot of years ago now. And if you want to make a comparison, these standards are very, very simple and therefore very, very used. And they come from the real-world applications, the practice. So people that want to implement something define this de facto standard and then use it. This is very good, but is limited to very simple use case. For example, if you want to implement something more complex, then Google, this kind of formats is not the best way to go. I make just an example how to handle interchanges between a train or a bus that you want then to ensure that they are internet together, and maybe the bus should wait for the train, and these kind of scenarios which are also quite common. So this is one way that a lot have gone. And on the other way, so NetX and SIRI, the good thing is that everything is covered from a theoretical point of view. You can imagine to build each possible complex type of scenario, and so we can call it a theoretical standard because it has been defined by people that are scientists, so in a certain way, and very theoretical, a lot of really, it's not that practical as GTFS has been developed. And this is the problem here, is that it's very complex. And at the moment, it's still little user, even if it's increasing, as we have seen also with the initiative MAAS4ITALYA. Maybe the colleagues then afterwards can say something. And this is also very interesting. This is typical European. Then so there is the European standard, so defined by the EU, and then each member state has decided to define profiles, because I've said these are theoretical standards. You can think to implement everything, but then if you wanted to have a practical implementation, you need a sort of technical specification about how you are going to implement it. And then I put just two examples. Of course, member states are much more in Europe. So for us, it's relevant, the German standard, because we are at the border with them. And then, of course, there is also an Italian standard, which are also defined by Cinque T of Torino, Rafael from Torino. And so we have to consider there are then transport operators that they have as focus provide mobility services. And now they have this regulation and all these initiatives, and then we say, okay, I have to provide data. My data is NetX and SIRI. And there is this kind of situation at the moment. So it can be really a nightmare for this kind of operators which don't have this kind of technological competencies to fulfill this kind of requirements. Okay, so that's the first part of the story. The second part of the story is about how Open Data Hub can play a role in all this kind of scenario, in this kind of game. Before starting to tell this and to explain how we can support this, you have also to know, and this is another story that we also presented also several times in the past years, in South Tyrol, and this is really something that we have to be proud of, there is one of the most relevant implementation of public transportation implementing this kind of standards among Europe and also worldwide, because we have really implemented in this kind of architecture, which I'm not going to present because it's quite complicated, but this is a reference implementation on how this kind of standards should be used among all the different components, from the components that manage the plan data up to the passenger information, ticketing, and so on. Probably you have seen on the buses there are new ticketing components. I think a lot of you use public transportation. So see even here from the start, which has implemented all this kind of stuff. Some issues are still on the system because it's still in its infancy, But a lot of European organizations are looking at about how we have built this kind of architecture, because they're saying this is exactly how you should implement these European standards. And just to mention also something interesting, here there is also this kind of reference. There are also standards about how the onboard components on the buses should communicate together the information. These are so-called IT4PT specification, and all the buses, in particular the new buses, are completely compliant with this specification. So we are speaking about 700 buses in the region. Okay? So, South Tyrol is part of this MAAS4ITALY project. And so it has been recognized as the most mature region in Italy that can accomplish and implement the architecture that I mentioned in the first slide of my presentation, because we already made this kind of system architecture. And the architecture that is under implementation, which is actually implemented, is the following one. So we have a component of managed by Star. This is all the public transportation system that can provide the data of public transport as NetX and Siri. But what was missing here was a connection with all the other mobility services available in South Tyrol. And this kind of integration we had since years with our Open Data Hub. So the integration with this kind of platform was quite simple, because for the public transportation, we had already NetX and Siri in the German profile, so we had to implement in the Italian profile. And we had to add the part for the other mobility services, which is then going to be the presentation of my colleague, Clemens, which will present how we did and we implemented it. So in very short time, we were compliant to the national architecture. Okay, then there is the final part of the story, which is also a very interesting part, in my opinion, one of the most, let's say, fascinating part of the future developments, which is an open source project which is called Open Trip Planner. And what does it have in relation with what I have said before? There's a lot of things, touch points with what I've presented, because this Open Trip Planner is an open source project which has a very interesting story, but we have to note that this is now managed by the Norwegian Transportation Authority, which is an in-house society of the Norwegian government. And they have decided we want to use this and to use on all our passenger information application. And so they released the version 2 of Open Trip Planner, which is a very powerful journey planning. So the journey planning, just for you to know, is an engine which you can provide trip suggestions. For example, you want to give as input, I want to go from A to B, and he provides a suggestion on which kind of mobility services you have to use. And what is interesting, now there is the possibility to support the new standards, so NetX and Siri. Why this is interesting? This is interesting because if you want to analyze what has been done at national level in implementing this national infrastructure, you will discover that at the end they use OTP version 2 as a core component. And this kind of component will be used then by the MAAS operators. And this is interesting because this Open Trip Planner can be a way to enhance and provide additional services. Now that's the role also of the Open Data Hub. You can then also have a way to visualize the quality of the information that you provide through your NetX and Siri. Because one of the challenges at the moment is that very few application and systems can use NetX and Siri and use it really on applications. If you want, and if you want to see some of this MAAS application development in the MAAS4ITALY project, there are also some colleagues. You can register and test and become tester of these MAAS applications. If you want, you can then also ask me if you are interested. But what we're implementing here at the Open Data Hub is an Open Trip Planner. We have an instance in our Open Data Hub. We have made these integrations, so actually this is already supported. Now all the data that we provide through NetX and Siri is ingested here. And we have a front end which is under development that then shows the responses of this OTP version 2. And the idea at the end, what we are going to have is, for example, this kind of intermodal connections. Like, for example, if you want to be from A to B from Bolzano Merano, you can make, for example, a bike sharing to the train station, then train, and then maybe a last mile in Merano. Okay, that's a little bit this future of mobility as a service. And what we want to make, also a proof of concept at the national level, is to integrate in the Open Data Hub all the NetX and Siri data which is made available at national level, integrated there, and have a front end can show the quality of the data that through this project is going to be integrated. Okay, so this was the story. I hope that it was interesting, and I hope that it was a good introduction for the following presentation. As I said, this was the original plan. So it's a pity that Roberto Martinelli from Liguria Digitale, which we had made a lot of things together in the last months, couldn't join from Liguria. And so the new program, as you have understood now, it's the following. We will have these 3 presentations. First of all, Guido Amato and Marco Comerio will make present a project in which they will talk about the GTFS real-time versus NetX and Siri. Clemens presenting what we have done for the implementation of these standards. And then again, Guido with another project.